Okay, let's look at this toolbox that we stopped at in the last podcast under adapting land use and protecting uh, public structures and services. So this is about regulations, codes, and standards. Well-designed regulations, codes, and procurement rules are the simplest approach to enhancing the quality, reliability, and resilience of infrastructure services. The most widely used applied solution, governments define the level of service expected from public or private infrastructure providers and apply it through procurement rules when the asset is publicly owned, for example, roads, market regulations when private actors provide services such as electricity, contractual engagement, for example, through the performance indicators for procuring and monitoring PPPs. I think I should clarify PPP here in case I'm assuming it's purchasing power parity, which is an economic thing. Yes, I definitely screwed that up even in the last podcast where I said PPP is purchasing power parity. I'm not paying attention as much attention as I should. PPP here in this particular book refers to public-private partnerships. So just remember that from the last podcast. Maybe I'll go and add it at the end to the last podcast. Okay. Regardless of the financial model, strong procurement rules and appropriate performance indicators in tender processes can ensure a minimum level of service and reliability. Although countries can define construction codes and regulations based on existing international standards, those at different income levels or with different preferences in terms of reliability will want to design regulations and codes that are adapted to their needs. So you have to balance the cost benefit versus lives to be saved. With climate change and other long-term trends, where is my pointer? Standards and codes need to be revised regularly, especially with the risk maps evolving. According to Vallejo and Mulan, approximately 1/3 of the OECD, Organization of Economically Cooperating and Developing Countries, are revising at least one mandatory national infrastructure standard to account for climate change adaptation, but similar processes are lacking in low and middle income countries. Sweden, for example, updated its road drainage standard in 2008, introducing a climate safety factor to cope with the anticipated increase in rainfall due to climate change. So small homogeneous countries that are well off, like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Germany maybe, are much more proactive about interventions to prepare for expected climate change impacts, but that's not possible for every country. Similarly, the European Commission mandated the Centre Européen de Normalisation. I'm learning French, but my pronunciation is not that great. So anyway, this was mandated to include climate change in the European civil engineering technical standards, the so-called Euro codes, especially for transport and energy infrastructure. Several national standards organizations have produced risk management guidelines that include climate change and resilience considerations for infrastructure, such as British Standards Institution 2011, Council of Standards Australia, US National Institute of Standards and Technology NIST. And in 2015, the International Standards Organization created an adaptation task force to develop standards for vulnerability assessment, adaptation and planning, and adaptation monitoring and evaluation. So every time now, whether it's the nationally determined contributions or these sorts of standards for infrastructure and so on, monitoring, evaluation and reporting are critical to make sure that we are on track to actually accomplishing the goals like increasing resilience, etc. Quality control, land enforcement of construction codes, quality control and enforcement of construction codes is particularly important. This Miyamoto International points out that enforcing construction codes and standards is costly and more challenging than defining them, which is always the case. Enforcement in the infrastructure sector requires a robust legal framework and strong regulatory agencies to monitor construction and service quality and performance and reward and penalize service providers based on their performance. So the legal framework allows private players to be held accountable for failing to meet the standards. Many regulators lack the resources and capacity to enforce existing construction codes, so you may have very few inspectors going around trying to manage a place like, let's say, city of Mumbai, where construction is booming all the time all over the place. As a result, expensive infrastructure systems may be designed with inappropriate materials or technologies, leading to high long-term costs, but many times also disastrous collapses. State of Bihar has had several bridges collapse, which is getting a lot of attention as well. Moving on to Action 2.3 under Adapting Land Use Plan and Protecting Structures and Services. Revise land use and urban plans to make them risk informed. Various ministries can be involved. Land markets are powerful tools for driving new construction in a way that efficiently meets population needs. However, they're also imperfect and often fail to fully internalize climate change and natural hazards. In some countries, dysfunctional land markets mean that most of the population lives in informal dwellings with no land use or urban planning. So even the heat wave that just killed 100 people or more in the state of Uttar Pradesh in India, heat wave was of course a natural hazard, but many of the mortalities were related to people not having proper housing. Were there early warnings to move people to hydration centers and cooling centers? That has to be looked at. Usually India has gotten better at managing disasters, but at some local scales somebody makes a wrong call without watching what the weather is going to be and put elderly people outside during a hot day without enough water supply or fans and so on and so forth. So adaptation at a short time scale can be as critical as what we are discussing here in terms of planning for the longer time horizons. I'll add Toolbox E here. Maybe the podcast will get a bit longer, but that's okay. Using geospatial information to identify priority land for urbanization. Okay, urban centers tend to expand haphazardly, taking over good agricultural land. Farmers are tempted to sell their land for high prices, or highway projects come in and take over land, etc. So how do you make them more robust in terms of resilience for the future? By using geospatial information to identify priority land. Risk-informed urbanization planning can help accommodate Fiji's growing urban population while limiting the increase in natural risks. So the island provides a nice mesocosm to test out these tools and approaches. In 2016, Nadi town, Fiji's third largest urban center, had a population of around 52,800 and was growing at a relatively rapid rate of 2.5% per year, which is massive, driven by tourism, transportation, and high-value real estate developments. So, it sought to identify areas for future settlements and infrastructure investment that would minimize exposure to natural risks and development costs. Fortunately, many of these island states have become very aware of climate change issues they face. Maldives, a lot of the small island states like Fiji, Vanuatu, Maldives, and so on. Planners used digital elevation models and flood maps as a first screen to identify areas that might be suitable for further development. We will see in figure E.1 the areas of Nadi that are highly exposed to coastal and river floods in red, blue, and orange. Those that are at high or extreme risk of flood in a 100-year return period flood risk maps are purple. Developed areas are gray, and areas with steep slopes are white. The return period is also something that is changing, so climate loads the dice, and events that are once in a 100-year may become once in 50 years or more frequent. So we always have to watch out for those in terms of projections. And there is no time to wait to see if statistics are robust enough to confirm that change in frequency happened. You have to prepare in advance, right? The light pink areas are potentially suitable for future development, although further studies are required to confirm this sample assessment. The simple assessment and more investment in drainage could make some of the flood-prone low-lying areas suitable for development. The exercise, so maybe I should show the figure here. So the digital elevation and flood maps help identify areas with development potential for Nadi town in Fiji. So here is the Nadi town, and there is the river that runs through it. So you have town boundary, below 2 meter elevation, below 3 meter elevation, below 4 meter elevation, developed areas including entire extent of town boundary, airport and buildings, and so on. So it's a very nice geospatial information use in building resilience and doing risk-informed urban development. Okay, the exercise identified about 4.3 square kilometers that were not developed within the town boundary. That's shown here in the inset. With additional investment to improve drainage, this land could be a priority for future development. With future densities of 10 to 15 dwellings per hectare, there is some breeze blowing, which is nice for me without AC, but it may perturb the sound in the recording, which I will make sure is not too bad. With future densities of 10 to 15 dwellings per hectare based on today's values, this area could host 4,300 to 6,500 households. In view of Nadi's backlog of about 2,000 units and its growth rate of 300 new households a year, this land could accommodate the town's urban growth of 8 to 15 years, which is good planning. Over the long term, town planners should consider areas beyond the town boundary. This could be combined with expanding the boundary. More than 45 square kilometers are available close to Nadi but outside the town boundary. This area could accommodate 45,000 to 70,000 households, enough to manage rural-urban migration for several decades. Using this land, however, would require addressing issues of land tenure and ownership and expanding networks, especially for water and sanitation and infrastructure like roads, bridges, etc. Hospitals, schools also have to be taken care of, right? So it's complicated, but it's being well informed. I'll stop this here and we'll come back and look at a few more points in adapting land use and protecting infrastructure and services. Okay.